This is R2D Tech and we're back with another video today. This time, everything you need to know about Linux, so stay tuned. Linux is something that most people have never heard of, and that's really surprising because it's so important in our everyday lives. Linux runs on most web servers and a growing number of personal computers. So what is Linux? It's commonly referred to as a family of operating systems which use the Linux kernel. Now, a kernel is the core of an operating system. It handles things like peripherals, memory, and I/O requests, converting them into machine code instructions which the CPU can then execute. The Linux kernel was created in 1991 by Linus Torvalds while he was at university. However, the Linux kernel doesn't make up a whole operating system by itself, and that's where GNU comes in. GNU stands for GNU is not Unix. It was created by Richard Stallman in the 1970s as an alternative to Unix, which was the most popular operating system at the time. However, Unix wasn't free and you couldn't alter the source code to customize the operating system depending on your needs. This was a huge problem for engineers like Richard Stallman. So GNU is effectively a collection of free and open source software which make up part of an operating system. This software includes the GNU compiler collection as well as the GNU C library and many more. The one thing that the GNU team could never complete was a good kernel, and it was around this time that Linus Torvalds created Linux. So it was kind of the perfect time to merge the two projects together. They now had a complete operating system. However, Linux's popularity had grown so much that it kind of overshadowed the contributions by the GNU team. Now, Richard Stallman, as the controversial and divisive character that he is, was a massive critic of this. He was a huge proponent of the name GNU/Linux, which never really caught on. To add to the divide, Linux and GNU are maintained by two separate organizations. Linux is maintained by the Linux Foundation and GNU is maintained by the Free Software Foundation. Despite this, both organizations are committed to keeping both projects free. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean free as in price, but rather free as in freedom. Freedom from surveillance, freedom of choice, and most importantly, freedom to change the source code to suit your personal needs. This is probably the reason why Linux has grown in popularity so much and why so many companies use it to run their servers. It's free and they can customize it depending on their needs. So let's actually move on to using Linux. Now, the first thing you're going to have to do if you're considering it is choose a distribution. A distribution is the name given to the individual operating systems which use the Linux kernel. Some of the most popular and beginner-friendly ones are Ubuntu and Fedora. However, before you decide to go with one of them, you should definitely check to see whether your personal machine supports that distribution, because not all of them do. One of the differences between Linux and macOS or Windows is that you can actually change the entire look of your desktop. There are loads of desktop environments to choose from, however the most important ones are GNOME, XFCE and KDE. If you're a complete beginner, then I would strongly recommend going for GNOME because it looks and feels quite a lot like macOS. Once you're actually playing around and using the operating system, you should see that it's pretty similar to the other mainstream operating systems. You can download a lot of the software that you could get on those other systems, with a few important exceptions, such as most games and also, for example, the Adobe Creative applications. You may notice that some things don't work, for example, Bluetooth or maybe even the sound. And for that, you might need to download some drivers which for some reason weren't included in the initial install. This is something that puts a lot of people off. However, if you follow a tutorial, most things are easily fixable. You may also notice that things are a lot snappier than when you are using, for example, Windows. That's because in general, Linux operating systems are much more lightweight than Windows. Like Linus Torvalds said, computers are like air conditioners. They both become useless when you open Windows. Now, the biggest difference between using Linux and macOS or Windows is probably the terminal. Users of Windows or macOS will probably never come into contact with the command prompt or terminal. Now, on Linux, it's practically unavoidable. The terminal is the command line interface of your operating system. If you open up a terminal in Linux, you'll be greeted with something straight out of the 1980s. And to be honest, it really hasn't changed that much since then. Most Linux terminals run the Bash command line language out of the box. Bash stands for Born Again Shell, and it's a Unix shell. You can think of a shell as kind of like a window into the internals of your operating system. It's called a shell because it's the outermost layer of your operating system, and you can do practically anything to your machine from here. This is why the terminal is still such a powerful tool. If you know the right command, you can do things a lot faster than if you were interacting with a graphical interface. For many software developers, this is the most important tool on their machine, and probably the first one they open in the morning. For some hardcore engineers, this is the only tool they need. You can edit and run code, you can download software, you can send emails, you can even play archaic games if you want to. Overall, the expansive set of tools that you get with the Linux terminal is probably the biggest benefit of the operating system itself. Now, if you're actually considering downloading and using Linux today, I would strongly recommend what's called dual booting. This is where you can partition your SSD to run Windows and Linux separately. When you power on your machine, you can then choose whether to enter Windows or your Linux distribution. It's a good way to see if Linux really suits you, and you always have the option to go back to Windows very easily if something doesn't work. This has been a brief overview of what Linux is and what it's like to use it. If you want to find out more, there are endless resources online. But that's it from this video, and if you liked it, please press the thumbs up button. If you loved it, please consider subscribing.